I think this technology linked with the national security and technological decisions, something intentionally being not to integrate but to separate. This is not new. But I think from a IT perspective, we always say, look, guys, but we all need to have the technology. We all need to agree how it will be kind of working together. We need to agree how it will be interoperate. So at least let's figure out how far we can go with that before there's a divergence happens. We find that standardization part can move pretty quickly, because standardization pieces, first of all, is about interested people coming together to develop something.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to Regulating AI, the podcast promoting responsible, ethical, and trustworthy AI practices globally. I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, and today we are honored to have with us Tomas Lamanauskas, the Deputy Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, ITU. Tomas brings truly a unique perspective to AI governance, combining over 20 years of international leadership experience across 4 continents. Starting his career as a computer science teacher in Lithuania, he's since led telecommunications regulatory authorities in Europe, the Middle East, and the Caribbean, and advised governments in the Pacific, and worked with multinational corporations across 13 countries. His academic foundation is equally impressive: a law degree from Vilnius University, a master's in telecommunications regulations from the University of the West Indies, and an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School, and leadership training from the London Business School. Wow, that's a handful. But as the Deputy Secretary General of ITU, the UN's specialized agency for ICTs, Tomas now oversees initiatives connecting nearly 8 billion people worldwide. And he's spearheaded the AI for Good Global Summit that brought together 11,000 participants from 169 countries, which we were very lucky to be participant in, and it was a fabulous conference. Tomas, welcome to the Regulating AI podcast.
Thank you very much, Sanjay, and thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. I'm really happy you had so many facts in, so thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful. Tomas, we were really, grateful to be a part of an incredible conference, which is the AI for Good in Geneva about a month or so ago. For our listeners who are global listeners, policy leaders, entrepreneurs, think tank experts, firstly, could you just briefly, especially for people who don't know, what is the ITU, and then how do you see ITU's unique role in shaping AI regulation, and what advantage does a telecommunication-focused agency, UN agency, bring to AI governance? Can you let our listeners know?
So thank you, my Sanjay. And I immediately a little bit address this aspect also, the telecommunications focused, in my conversation here as well. So first of all, ITU is the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies. So we did start quite a while ago, 160 years ago. So double the age of United Nations now. We celebrate 80 years this year. We celebrated 160. At that time, to regulate and ensure cross-border operation of what was then groundbreaking technology of telegraph. In the recent event, moderator actually kind of read out for audience what electric telegraph is. I was a bit surprised, but maybe I'm geek, so I thought that everyone learns that still at the school. But just to maybe for the audience that may not have done that, so electric telegraph, it was basically original way through the wires to exchange information electronically, and sometimes if you hear in the movies is beep, 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 beep. So that's the kind of impression of telegraph and Morse code and other things, how people would communicate at that time. So when telegraph was invented, initially it would work only within the borders, and then to make sure it works across the borders. So that's where standards needed to be agreed among the nations. And that's why they set up what was at that time International Telegraph Union, signing International Telegraph Convention in Paris. So that was 160 years ago. Since then, of course, ITU was always in the forefront of different technological revolutions. I would say what we now would call digital technology, but of course, in that time, there was the digital had a bit of a different meaning still. So from telegraph, we went to the wireless, so maybe simpler to say, your mobile phone needs wireless, so because that's how it connects to the global network. But also your microphone that you use on a stage and is connected by wireless, your Bluetooth headphones also use wireless, and everything around the world in this kind of invisible radio waves, that connect all the devices. So ITU started in early 20th century regulating that, agreeing globally how different radio waves would be used. It's also that standardization is key because for manufacturers to produce a device, they need to know that those devices will be used in the same way in different parts of the world. So that was very important. Then we went to satellites. And again, in 1957, the first satellite was launched into space. In 1963, the first conference, what we called World Administrative Space Conference, which is specifically on how to regulate the emerging space sector, especially from radio context. But again, because for the satellites to operate, they need radio waves, But then what we realized as well, that also is not only the radio waves, but also place in orbit so that they can find their own space there. So that was a new technology that again ITU had to embrace. And then in 90s, what was also realized is not only about standardization and technological progress, it's about having it available to all. So in the 90s, we added our development arm, which is now called development sector, or which is supported by our Bureau of Development, which is basically focuses on democratizing, if you will, technology, bringing it to everyone. And in that moment as well, successive, let's say, waves of technological change, and ITU had to be at the forefront of that, from the internet and all the underlying digital infrastructure to, of course, the mobile revolution that changed the way people connect to the telecoms. But then all the application layer, what we call, and then, of course, now artificial intelligence, metaverse, quantum, and other things. Because just to give an example why I'm saying it's not just telecoms, and then this the AI piece is not surprising, is because, if you look at ITU history as well, for example, and what we're known for example, video codecs and broadcasting quality. For those who actually have a number of Emmy awards, and again, some people don't know that there are Emmy awards for engineering, and ITU actually is a holder of quite a few of them. And then at the same time, for example, rather famous public key infrastructure, basically the underlying infrastructure for electronic and digital signatures. That's again ITU standardized aspects as well. So I think it's more appropriate these days to say we have a very strong roots in telecoms, and of course that is still a very strong foundational element of ITU. These pipes that bring the digital information around the world. But at the same time, other layers of that technology, applications, today we're calling also digital public infrastructure. So creating this enabling layer for education, for health, for public services, and then going to these technologies, artificial intelligence, all of that is within the ITU's scope and mandate and activities as well.
Wow. From telegraph to mobile to satellite to now AI. Tomas, AI is moving exceptionally rapidly. Probably from in talking to a lot of my guests, unlike any other technology. You build standards around telegraph, around telecommunications, around satellites. How is this different? I mean, with something that is moving so rapidly, do you think standardization, and would that stop innovation? Because is it innovation first, standard first? I mean, that's the debate that's at least happening in the US right now. What is ITU's perspective on that?
Thank you very much. And again, on this word rapidly, because I think being a 160 years organization, we sometimes have a perspective a little bit different on things, And it's like in the same, like we see things like, in telecoms, things. So from one hand, things move very rapidly, different technologies, different generations, different applications. But then submarine cable has been there now for some decades, and they are the bulk of how the information is carried. In the same way, AI, we, of course, since ChatGPT kind of brought that to everyone's attention in 2022, we see this rapid revolution. But look, when in my high school, I was learning about neural networks as well, and I was kind of poking around. And sometimes I give this example to people that for a few decades, every time you get a speeding ticket and the camera takes the picture of your number plate and then translates from the picture to numbers, that's AI at work. I mean, more simplified AI than ChatGPT, but this AI is a neural networks. Is a and the way those neural networks learn how to convert from picture to number is not so different. How neural networks learn how to actually produce those different words from the vast amount of information they have, and then numbers. But this, of course, is a scaling laws. Much more power, much more computing power is thrown at it. Much more data is thrown at it. And of course, now the consumer products are becoming much more accessible. So that is the perspective, So of course, and that's why you didn't start AI in 2022. Actually, if you look at our flagship, and you mentioned AI for Good Summit, so the first edition of AI for Good Summit was in 2017. And the first time United Nations convened what we now call interagency working group on AI, which brings UN family together and led by TU and UNESCO, was in 2020. So that's already pretty recent. And then, of course, a lot of other developments and discussions about AI were way before that. So I think having that perspective helps, because having that perspective allows us to distinguish things that really change very rapidly and the things that actually remain relatively stable. And I think thereby there are different layers there. I think standards actually in many ways is an answer rather than a challenge in this kind of fast-moving environment. Because I think the question that other people ask, how you ensure that regulation environment, policy environment, governing environment, can adapt to this technology revolution. That's what we learned from telecoms and others, that you have to have this multi-layer governance. That first at the top of it says policies, that kind of where the governments agree on ethical requirements, on consumer requirements, on the technology needs to be brought to everyone. So they're very high level principles, Then there's the regulations that kind of translate those principles into rules. And then there's the standards that then allow technology to adapt and to be matched to those regulations and policies. Now, sometimes, if you don't do it right, then people try in the policy on regulation to codify everything. And then, of course, things don't move very fast, because first of all, it's difficult to agree. And then once you agree, the technology will already have changed by that. So that's why having that full ecosystem of instruments, if you will, of the way of approaches to govern things and technology and to kind of come together is really useful. We find that standardization part can move pretty quickly, because standardization pieces, first of all, is about interested people coming together to develop something, and usually it's a very collaborative way. It's not only just governments, it's academia, it's private sector, it's other stakeholders. And that's what ITU is pretty unique UN agency in that regard, because we not only have 194 member states, we also have more than 1,000 is what we call sector members. So these means all the other stakeholders that actually have a membership, and they participate in that process in a pretty rapid way. And they can iterate, so you can do one standard, you can do another version of standard as technology evolves, and then you can help match that standard development, as I say, to regulatory and policy requirements there. Of course, innovation, look, I think it's also innovation cutting edge is done by private sector, by research centers, sometimes by governments. And of course, this is the cutting edge technology. This is where that needs to be. I think what ITU comes into play as an agency and as a standard development organization, where the technology needs to be available to everyone, either both for commercial reasons, because the companies and others want to expand their markets, and when you have a standard that makes it more acceptable in other markets and also lowers the cost of technology development, because of we can reach more markets, and also for public policy interest, public policy reasons, because you then through the standardization again make the technology more available to everyone. You encourage interoperability, or in telecoms world we call it interconnection. So that means that different islands of technology can work together. So these worlds actually drive each other. So we need innovation, sometimes proprietary innovation, to go very fast and bring these new ideas and opportunities. But then standardization comes there to play, to actually make sure that innovation can spread and can be adopted by many people.
Standardization can be adopted. I think it's very well said. Tomas, do you feel like, from a standards perspective, there is not an enforcement mechanism that you have? Do you believe that kind of holds you back? I mean, what is it that you can actually, from a standard standpoint, enforce? I'm talking now AI, etc. How do you balance that?
I mean, first of all, ITU is a part of ecosystem, so it's not a beginning or end of all. I think we have a very important role in ecosystem, but we part of the ecosystem. It's the enforcement role most of the times falls onto national governments, and then national governments can actually have these policy decisions and then enforcement actions to actually ensure compliance. What ITU is there is to help those national governments in many ways do the job in a way that actually is not disruptive to the private sector and actually encourages innovation. But then at the same time allows them to do the job. So, for example, having a two standard makes it much easier for the government to regulate, because they don't need to say every time. The government doesn't need to invent a new set of regulations, set of rules, set of standards, quote unquote. The government can say, look, whatever ITU or the standardization body said at this time agreed, that is requirement. And that's been, for a long time. For example, telecommunications quality of service, that was the way. If you look a lot of country regulations, they would simply refer to ITU standard and would say, look, whatever ITU standard at the time is, that's kind of what you need to comply with. And then as the technology develops, so then ITU standard would develop, and then governments would naturally, automatically, through incorporation or through reference, would dare to say regulatory framework would update. And in a way, that's what ITU and other standardization bodies give it to the broader ecosystem. So give this agreed, most of the time consensually, sets of rules, sets of protocols, sets of standards, which then different stakeholders can use, whether to incorporate that in the national regulatory frameworks, international or regional regulatory frameworks, or to self-adopt and self-certify. And sometimes, so those players can say, look, this is the standard I comply with. Sometimes these standards can be referred into the procurement rules and regulations or contracts. So this is the way to actually move the governance without immediately imposing something, but using that plethora of other, let's say, enforcement mechanisms, whether it's national, whether it's contractual, whether it's other ways. Another piece which is very important, I think, is broader than standards, but it's also like a general, our convening power, is the shining the light. And I think the shining the light is also important, because then, when you say to the people, look, this is how some set of people do it, other people do it, through that, you can encourage people to comply with different rules and standards, like what we do with our Green Digital Action Initiative. We're bringing stakeholders who say they care about digital industry to be sustainable and contributing to the fighting climate change. And then through that, we then push them to adopt some standards and back up their words with their specific commitments, and then we kind of track that. So while shining the light, you also kind of, self-enforcement, encourage self-enforcement and soft enforcement. And finally, which just sounds the softest out of that, but actually a lot of time is very impactful, is a place, is a venue, and that's where UN part of ITU comes in, is a venue to kind of agree and signal global values and global principles and global objectives. Because when you kind of signal that and you say, look, the local community is interested in that, it's very often it's not the mere words, because that drives other policy decisions. That drives national discussions on what are right policies, that drives discussions between private sector and the government, that drives corporate policies and corporate initiatives from the private sector side, because they want to align with that. Like always, the good example is the kind of Sustainable Development Goals agenda, which is kind of, has a lot of self-adoption. So, and if you say, oh yeah, but this is just a framework, but then you see how many groups of people actually say, no, we want to align with this. This is what you do because of that. And I think the same with all these other discussions is about having those frameworks, and here, for example, ethical frameworks on AI and discussions about about the environmental impact of AI, that then drive those discussions on different other layers, and say, okay, no, we actually need to think about that when we do something nationally or on the corporate level.
No, so I think you made three key points here for our listeners. One is the standards become a guiding light for countries maybe to adopt easily. Hey, they can point to ITU. but then also there is a shining light. So it makes companies or whatever else stakeholders, hey, are we following these standards? Maybe gives them a competitive edge. And finally, it gives a location or a place to convene the UN, etc., for different stakeholders. I think that's a very important perspective, Thomas. Thomas, uh, you said bringing people together, and I don't know in terms of telegraph and telecom. Right now, it seems like there are three centers of AI governance that are developing. The EU has the EU AI Act. The US has basically an America first innovation, and China has more a state-driven AI governance. They just announced that they also want a global governance perspective. Looking at what has happened before in ITU, or how you see this kind of groupings, what is your perspective on how this kind of plays out in the mission that ITU has in terms of AI governance and standards?
I think, first of all, that different approaches is nothing very original in a way, because we even have that in a much more narrow telecoms world. We had we had sometimes, if you look at third generation mobile telecommunications, it was much more kind of regionally based, and before that, just maybe we had a big split between, say, North American standards or American standards and European standards. But then, if you look now, the 4G adoption has actually became more kind of integrative. And actually, like we, of course, as ITU would like to believe that, and we see some examples from telecoms world, the more global approaches, the more successful and fast rollout it is. But at the same time, especially when it's a new technology or a relatively new technology in the policymakers' eyes and in the kind of adopters' eyes, I think experimentation is a very healthy thing to have. And I think it's useful to have these different approaches and to see which one will have its own advantages and which will suit different environments as well. Because I think different cultural environments and different historical environments also drive adoption technologies. Like I remember this discussion, like in Scandinavia and even Lithuania, where I am, we always like to just kind of talk about like where I'm from, like this whole idea about single IDs, single digital IDs, having these single databases, like from your health system, your health system connected with your kind of employment system and the driver's license, and you have like this very useful governing system. In some countries that have a bit of a different history, that's a big no. Like a couple people say, no, I don't want government to know everything about me. Whereas in some countries say, no, I actually want that usefulness of everything, government knowing everything about me, so that they don't need to kind of bring that information every time to different government agencies. This is an example from non-AI world that is not just about like which approach is best, but it's also about like different cultures and different societies have their own different approaches to the technology. I think with artificial intelligence, we are now at that stage. And those different approaches are probably most fitted for the societies that kind of have them. Now, what ITU is there to do, and organizations like ours, is to bring them all together and to allow them to share those experiences, hopefully to see whether there are some commonalities there, so on which we can all agree, and usually we always see that there's some layer there that we all can agree on, and then kind of there's a layer that we can't. Then on the layer that we don't necessarily agree, seeing maybe it's a merit of each other, where we can actually adopt things from each other. And then I think that's what's most important. Then you mentioned three centers, but I think there's a lot of countries that are not in neither. And I think those countries that are in neither, they're actually a lot of times forgotten, especially in this bigger geopolitical discussion. People like I mentioned, three centers, and as if this is the world. But a lot of other parts of the world, at least they consume the technology, and actually a lot of them have a right and would like to participate in technology development. So for them, it's very useful to come and hear these different approaches and to understand what's best for them. And it may not be neither of them directly. It could be some combination of elements of all of them to adapt it for their own. And I think that is also a very important role that is playing. So for example, when we did last year, we had our first AI Governance Day at the AI for Good Summit. So this year was the second. So the first year, we basically brought all these different, let's say, agreement groups or convening groups on AI together to share. We said, okay, what does G7 do? What does G20 do? What is what's called Bletchley process? What has been discussed there? What does European Union think? What does the United States of America think? What does China think? And then kind of within that kind of create that platform for all of them share, understand, and even understand each other. Because a lot of times when we say, and what you said, that we kind of oversimplify as well. Let's be open. We kind of see those frameworks in specific blocks, and when we kind of put that in a bit of a stereotypical environment. But when you start unwrapping, you start understanding some of the more nuanced reasons, sometimes beyond that. And that's where, and then you allow to see the results, allow everyone to brag about results those different approaches achieve. And then you say, okay, let's kind of choose for ourselves what's best, and let's kind of maybe go through these cycles, and maybe at some point we'll start converging a little bit. But that's kind of where I think the idea of ours, we don't seek to have a kind of global one framework that everyone will have to buy to. We actually try to encourage learning between the different frameworks and different ecosystems, different groups or different country groups or countries, to say, so that everyone kind of has that information to be able to choose for themselves what works best for them.
Uh, I think that's fantastic. One question I had is that AI, at least that I'm based here in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
the discussion of AI has become more about national security or geopolitical perspective. That either you're going to be in one side or another with the ecosystem. There's restrictions on chip exports and things like that. I mean, I know there was the GSM, CDMA, the 4G, etc. Is there a historical precedence of something like this in ITU's history? I mean, this is, again, you know better. And then how does one deal with something like that?
I mean, this historical precedence or differences is like, even if you look at the history, the reason why railway rails are different
Mhm.
width has to do with the national security in some circumstances, and also that the enemy couldn't get the same train on the rails when they invade you.
Mhm.
So I think this technology linked with the national security and technological decisions, something intentionally being not to integrate but to separate. This is not new. Then these other aspects, so as you mentioned, you said, CDMA versus GSM kind of standards, but even on the broadcasting, when we started with digital broadcasting, and before, we had like a different standards that were not that easy to let's say combine. So this is kind of divergent technological developments are not new by themselves. I think now they're so visible because the digital technology and AI is so pervasive, because it's not a part, it's not a sideshow, it's not a part of our lives. This is our lives, we kind of live that way. So I think, in a way, what we try to do, though, in HU, and always, we kind of go like, look, we are kind of global organization. We're not a club of like-minded countries. There are a lot of like-minded country clubs. We're not like a group of like specific industry group that wants to kind of promote specific technology. We're the place when people come to talk with everyone, including those they would not never agree with. So that's kind of when they come to the UN. Because this is a place when you totally disagree, you can still come and you can still talk, and that's what ITU's raison d'etre 160 years was. As I sometimes say, even when you fight and you're at war, you still need to have a way to call each other. So to stop that war and to say like, look, maybe let's stop it now. So I think now with AI, I think that's, again, this is of course national security matters, geopolitical matters, which we as ITU don't kind of opine on. This is for every country to have. What we say, can we in all these still to agree, and as I mentioned before, on some common principles? Are there still commonalities? And the only commonality can be, for example, that we still would like to be learning from each other. Or then the commonality can be that actually some of the systems need to work with each other. For example, like internet. No, we can have a very different approaches. What is the freedom of speech in different parts of the world, and what's the balance between freedom of speech and public security? But we all agree more or less that we all want that message to go from one point to another. So, and that was always a TU kind of raison d'etre. That we don't kind of say which kind of value system at the different ends would be, but we say that whatever it is, we still enable people to kind of communicate, and then once they start communicating, then they can discuss value systems and everything else on top of that. And maybe sometimes they actually agree quite a bit. Now in ITU, for example, discussion on human rights is becoming like rather prominent topic that in the past it wasn't. Where people now see how to integrate some human rights aspects in technology. So, but that's because the baseline here is that we need to agree. Like I have another example on submarine cables. that we started working since last year very actively on operational part, and because we saw a lot of breaks, and again, a lot of people saw that as a huge political issue, a national security issue, and again, for ITU to be able to work with that, we had to take it to the notch at the level where it's a joint agreement that we all need that ecosystem of submarine cables to work, because that's how the digital world is connected. And that's why we now have International Advisory Board on Submarine Cable Resilience that has everyone, all the geopolitical powers I mentioned before, has in that body together. And actually, for example, we had this so-called Abuja Declaration. They all managed to agree on it. I mean, on the principle level, and that's why people sometimes are disappointed that UN maybe is not concrete enough. But you see, that's the purpose of these frameworks and this ecosystem, to agree what we can agree and then kind of slowly see where the limits is. So for now, and now kind of what happens here, and I think I'm back to this, the newer the technology is and the faster the technology moves, everyone wants to kind of capture the benefits of it and see the value of this, and that's natural. There are, of course, some, because the digital technologies are so pervasive, people have some concerns, what that could mean for their lives, if there are some threats or some sort of resilience issues in that technology. So all is very normal. But I think from a ITU perspective, we always say, look, guys, but we all need to have the technology. We all need to agree how it will be kind of working together. We need to agree how it will be interoperate. So at least let's figure out how far we can go with that before there's a divergence happens.
So you bring at least some semblance of commonality that people can agree on, because we all, whether it is telecommunications, telegraph, or the internet, or AI, we all need it. So I think that's a great point. You very minutely touched on this, and I want our listeners to understand. You talked about undersea cables, such a vast amount of what the data, even you and I talking right now on this podcast, is driven by the undersea cables, right, Thomas? And why this is so critical that people, and obviously in the past year and so, we've seen some issues that have popped up. So ITU is trying to create some consensus on that too, right, Thomas?
No, exactly. Look, this is like the conversation between you and I now definitely are going through submarine cables, because it's, first of all, different continents, and even if we were in the same continent, it's likely that somewhere something is being transmitted. Actually, 99% of the international traffic goes through the submarine cables, and when the even signal goes up to satellites, still goes back to the submarine cable to be transmitted. So this is crucial infrastructure. On one hand is a lot of it, 1.7 million kilometers, if you think. But on the other hand, it's just a little, because it's around 500 of those cables, around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And like sometimes, I show the people, I don't think I have it around me now, but I show the people how that cable looks like. It's not much larger than my kind of small finger, So, and that's this is like the infrastructure that we rely on, So, and they break, there's around 200, let's say, breaks a year, that we experience, like around the world. So this is something that we need to kind of take care of, So now, as a community, because sometimes that cable may break in place A, in let's say, Mediterranean or Red Sea, and it can impact a lot of communication between the continents, and sometimes, like between Europe and Asia, but also then because of other things, the different continents as well. So this is really have a unspecified effect. So that the fact that cable broke in your territorial sea doesn't mean that it's only you are affected. Like actually big parts of the world can be. So we brought that community together. We brought in experts, actually 40 experts plus 2 chairs, which is Nigerian Minister of Digital Technologies and regulator of telecommunications from Portugal, that are chairing this, and as I said, a very inclusive way, because there's also governments from all the parts of the world, the private sector, and others, to kind of agree on the common rules of the road. And we say, like, what practices do we need to instill to make sure that those cables can be deployed fast, repaired fast, the permits can be given fast, because some of the things sound very technical, like getting permit to repair, but if that permit to repair takes 3 months to get, imagine how much disruption you have to experience, because that cable is not working for that 3 months, so these things, and because there's only a few of them, if six of them are cut, and that's not uncommon, by the way, out of that, how much, and especially in strategic locations, how much of that is impacted. We're also looking in the better monitoring, basically knowing the data. Data is always a challenge, so that we can take better actions. And also, we're still looking at these white spots, so the countries or territories, especially that still applies to small island developing states, where that connectivity, submarine cable connectivity, may not be still available. So how to plug that, and we're kind of having working groups that are looking into that. So I think the idea is to really progress on that. ITU doesn't come there as a newcomer. We had a standardization side of it, where we've been developing cable standards on the technology side, but now, and most of the cables are based on our technology, standardized technology. But now we kind of moving to more kind of understanding the operational and policy side, and we have great partners there in the name of International Cable Protection Commission, which is an industry body that's also partnering with us on that to make sure that we have a very strong industry perspective in this.
Well, for folks, so that they can correlate why we're talking about this, is just so that you understand, when you put a prompt into ChatGPT, there's a good chance it's going through some of those cables that Thomas is talking about. Thomas, you've spoken at length and with your past about making sure that AI and digital benefits everybody. You talked about AI equity. You work in a place like Palau and other places, etc. And you talked just now about, hey, there are people who don't want to be in these three blocks or whatever groupings we call these. How do we make sure, or how is ITU making sure, whether it is the Pacific Islander nations, their culture? Remember, AI is driven by, the internet is 70% English, Western oriented culture. How do we make sure that firstly they see the benefits of AI, and also their language, their culture, their history, in many cases going back hundreds and thousands of years, also are part of this dialogue?
No, thank you, Sanjay. And that's indeed one of the most rewarding parts of my career, was spending the time in places like Vanuatu or British Virgin Islands, where you can see how the technology brings benefit to the people in a very direct way. And actually, the more remote the place is, the more impact of technology can be felt very fast. Once the technology happens, because the markets are opened, education, information is opened, and our ability to reach out, the world really kind of makes a huge transformational difference. So it's not only about technology. For us, we see the technology sometimes, like if we sit in Washington D.C. or like me in Geneva, see technology as kind of improving the way we do. But in some cases, when submarine cable and the connectivity or general internet connectivity is first introduced in some of the remote communities, this is like transformational for the community, in both good way, because it can open more markets, new information, all others, but also in new risks way, because it can open up new risks that the community hasn't dealt with before. Like I'm saying, for some of us, for example, this internet was a transition from television or radio, and others. If you look at the remote island in Vanuatu, that could be that when the telecenter was built and internet came there, that could be the first time the certain kind of information came in, full stop. So, and that's kind of creates new challenges by itself. But there is this huge opportunity piece, and I think that opportunity piece, as I mentioned, the more remote and less the place, the more opportunity it gets when this thing opened. Like we saw that with the mobile phones, mobile payments and others. Like for us, mobile phone in many ways was like, okay, additional technology. A lot of people was access to finance, because of the mobile finance, or access to education, or access to market prices, information. So the same with AI, So I think, the less developed, for example, your educational system is, the maybe more benefit AI can bring. And actually, it's interesting. We have some statistics that in Europe, for example, people more fear of AI, around 2/3 fear of job losses and other things. Whereas if you look at lower mid to middle income countries, more people are positive. 2/3 of them say, no, actually, AI will probably improve our lives, and sometimes more even than 2/3, but improve our lives, provide new opportunities, create better jobs, but also provide new opportunities for health and education. So this is, and I call it opportunity divide, which usually goes opposite, which is for some reason goes opposite way than other divides. Now coming to other divides, so means how we bring it. So this is very multifaceted. Of course, infrastructure piece is still important. You spoke and you explained the audience submarine cables importance, and this is like, it is not trivial. I mean, if you don't have infrastructure, which we take as granted, all these fancy apps will not work. So from submarine cables to access technologies like mobile broadband or fixed broadband to data centers. You need to have infrastructure, and you have this huge divide. Still, 2.6 billion of people are not connected. And low-income countries, around a third people only are connected. Imagine, like, if 2/3 of people in Washington D.C. didn't have a phone, it would be weird, no? So in low-income countries, only a third people are still connected. Now, if you look data centers, for example, like in Africa is around just short of 20% of world's population. Like nearly 19, I think, exact. It has less than 2% of data centers. So it's kind of the whole Africa. So again, if you look, so 90% of AI compute data centers are owned from two countries. So you probably guess which country those two countries are. So there's a huge divide in infrastructure. It's then also divide in innovativeness. You have more than 70% of the patents are coming from two countries as well. So you have those divides again on innovativeness as well. And then the policy divide, which is kind of interestingly is correlated, because still more than half of the countries don't have the policies. 85% don't have regulations or strategies on AI. And of course, it's correlated, because if you don't understand what AI is or don't have access, it's difficult to write a policy for it. But at the same time, if you don't write the policy, it may not be encouraging your market to develop. So these are the things. So now I think, and then AI skills in a broader system. So I think for ATU, this is like a multi-stack, if you will, multi-layered problem, that we need to resolve. And we're trying to, and that's where being ATU, which comes from digital infrastructure, we're now all the way to kind of applications and technologies like AI, is very useful, because we have that understanding of the full ecosystem, I would think. So that's why we tackle infrastructure gaps. We assessed, and through our digital infrastructure investment initiative that we run with 7 multilateral development banks, that around 1.6 trillion US dollars are needed to invest in infrastructure, to bring infrastructure around the world to the same level. And we need to spend it by 2030, and that includes data centers, includes functional or meaningful, we say, internet connectivity. We'll look at the policy development, and our AI governance day, and working with others as well, of helping countries to understand what the right policies to bridge that policy gap. We'll look at the skills gap. So we have on our flagship AI Skills Coalition with more than 50 partners, that have a different AI capabilities, and now how to push those AI skills to the people. So all these different aspects, from infrastructure to skills, really to kind of encourage that development. Now, what's very important for us, and that's, I think, again, what shows some of the initiatives, that in ideas, creativity, and enthusiasm is not it doesn't have the same divide as technology sometimes. Because we run these things we call AI Innovation Factory with startups pitch from all around the world. We run these things called AI machine learning competitions, where the coders pitch the ideas from around the world. We have these things we call robotics challenges, or where the high school teams from all the world compete, and program robots, to tackle real life challenges like disaster management. And you see a lot of teams from all around the world. I visited a robotics team in Nigeria, just outskirts of Abuja. Like, eyes are lit up, eyes are lighting up of these kids when they I nearly said play, but they don't play with those robots, because they need the same programming as a big robot we have. They actually resolve real life challenges with robots. You have these examples for Innovation Factory from an entrepreneur from Ghana who uses AI to check crop health, and to kind of address those issues. Entrepreneur from Rwanda who uses mobile to take pictures and do the preliminary health assessments. So you have a lot of ideas. So and that's why I think, concluding it here, that once you bring people tools that we have a bit of a feel joint responsible to do, then those ideas start building up, and then all these other things that you mentioned, language aspects and the relevance aspects, starts being resolved, because those people are resolving them for themselves. They don't need you to resolve those aspects. They will resolve those once they have tools to do that.
So empower them, I think, is what you're saying. And with connectivity, with data, with skills, I think an ITU plays a key role. concluding on where we began, Thomas, which is the AI for Good Summit. You've been the key force behind what has turned into the largest summit for AI. Tell our listeners, I mean, I was there, it was incredible. Uh, just what is this summit? What are some of the conclusions, the objectives, and what have been the results that have come out of it, and the different aspects, so that a lot of them next year should participate. But it is truly a remarkable conference where actually I got a chance to speak to Will I Am. But anyway, that's a whole different story. So, Thomas, tell our listeners about the conference, which is your brainchild in many ways, AI for Good.
Thank you, Sanjay. So this is actually a product of a lot of great people in ITU, and actually started. And I have to confess, before I joined ITU this time, so this means,
Mhm.
the first iteration was already in 2017, and some brave people at that time were very foresightful, said let's start building it. And of course, then current Secretary General Doreen and me being part of the team, I think it was really proud moments to being able to take that as well with the team and actually make that asset even bigger and greater, and as it is, because I think we were, with this development, we're in the right time. When the AI interest exploded, we already had a very functioning, AI for Good summit, and then suddenly it got everyone's attention. And what I think the few things are important, and I say why people should be there. First of all, it is the largest the UN event on artificial intelligence. And I think that's, so we have 53 UN partners there. It's not just a ITU event. It's actually UN-wide 53 partners event that all come together, all share ideas, all bring their own perspectives. And that's very important, because I think for AI, it's also the event where you start seeing how the power of AI expresses itself, not in the technology itself, but in its application in different areas. You see people talking about AI in agriculture. We just launched an initiative on that. You see people talking about AI in health, people looking at the transport, how AI impacts transport. And you probably saw in our exhibition, some of the new passenger drones. So people thinking about jobs. We have International Labor Organization really looking into that, how AI would impact jobs, and how we need to adjust in that. People thinking about ethical things. So it's really the broad scope. It all is united because it's UN or conference through that, of course, lens for good. That means how do we leverage that to really improve our lives, improve the prosperity, improve the sustainability, make our lives better. End of the day. Like both our individual lives, our countries better. So that, but this angle is very diverse. Now, it also means that it comes that we have a huge participation. So we had, for UN at least, we had 11,000 people this year. Physically, we had 10,000 people connected online. That's, I think, double from last year, triple from the year before. So there's still an exponential growth. That's why encouragement already to book your tickets early, so that you get there and get in place. But also is different stakeholder groups. So we had 169 countries represented. We had around 115 minister, deputy minister, head of regulator level, and also really kind of decision makers. We had different stakeholder groups, academia, private sector, like really from different parts of the world to really engaging there. And then you have, through the program, you look at through different lenses. You look through a governance lens, you look from standardization lens, you look from the solutions lens, and then you actually experience actual solutions in our exhibition floor. Like brain machine interfaces, like as I said, drones, so like specific other applications down in details, like telecom networks, that you can see AI making a difference. So I think this is the event for everyone who wants to understand how, not just to kind of how to bring that technology together, the policy, and then kind of make an impact for the world at large. And I think anyone who kind of feels that about AI and or any new emerging technology, we had a quantum track since this year, and we probably will continue next. So we're having a bit of a space discussions as well. Should be there with us next year. It's already the dates. So 7 to 10th of 7 to the 10th of July next year, here in Geneva, in Polexpo, the biggest conference venue in Geneva. So we hope to see you here, and we hope to really progress that dialogue with everyone and progress that work with everyone to make sure that the AI, as you rightly kind of a few times referred, is not just a kind of this fancy technology that we can talk about few countries in the world that can benefit of that, but the AI power, the positive power, is really felt around the world by everyone.
Yeah, and for our listeners, I have to say it was exceptionally well managed. Geneva is a great city, and Palexpo is wow. It's right next to the airport. But this was very different. I've been to a lot of AI conferences, but really, truly AI for good, Thomas. So, Thomas, thank you really for joining us on the Regulating AI podcast. Your work at ITU with your cross regional, especially your work across the world, your experiences. And explaining why standards are important, why ITU is important, and let's focus on what brings us together, not keeps us separate. I think has been exceptionally helpful, and also talking about AI for good. And for our listeners, just remember that AI regulation isn't just about constraining technology; it's about ensuring that artificial intelligence truly serves all of humanity, from the smallest island states to the largest economies. And that's what Thomas has been talking about. This is the Regulating AI podcast. I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, and we'll see you next time as we continue exploring how we shape responsible AI governance for our global future. Thomas, this was fantastic. Really, thank you for taking the time. This was great. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you. It was really a pleasure for me to be part of this. Thank you very much.